the one and only Garland Nixon. Garland, welcome back to the show. Before we turn to the domestic political scene, and all politics is local in the end, I see we've got matching tartan ties on. It's wonderful to see it. The international situation could scarcely be more grave this evening. Reports of chemical or biological attack, maybe both, by Ukrainian forces on Russian forces in the Ukraine, the apparently imminent danger of a full military assault by the Ukrainian military on a nuclear power plant, the announcement that any radiation leak from that plant would be treated as an Article 5 trigger by the NATO countries, bringing NATO into the war, the terrorist murder of a prominent Russian journalist and commentator's daughter in Moscow, it suddenly grew very dark, didn't it, Garland?
Yes, and I think we could have predicted that this would be a very difficult August and September, simply because it's getting very obvious at this point that the Ukraine military operation is kind of reaching a crescendo in the Donbass area, that very shortly, probably within weeks, it will be clear that this thing is over in the Donbass area, that the Russians have taken the major part of Ukraine, that they have, effectively broken the Ukrainian military, which creates a level of desperation, particularly with the Ukrainian leadership. Also, the incidents that recently happened and the rise of tensions in the Pacific, I think, also create an air of desperation in the Ukrainian leadership, feeling that the tension there may cause the focus to leave Ukraine. So I think it could be predicted that in this time period we're in, within this month and a half time period, and time period leading up to the midterms, there'll be a tremendous amount of desperation, and there will be event after event that is an attempt to try to move the needle one way or the other. I will end by saying this. I do believe, based on what I saw in the way that the Chinese responded to the Pelosi incident, that Russia and China both are going to be cool and level-headed, aren't going to take the bait and be drawn into any major conflicts. But, it'll be interesting to see what happens from the other sides.
Now, the Samson option is an obvious one for Zelensky and his gang in Kiev. They came to power as the result of a bloody coup in fire and shot and hail. They must expect to go out of power in a similar way. Bringing down the temple on top of themselves is an obvious temptation for them. What I'm struggling to understand is why the Western countries who bankroll and arm this whole thing and who have been behind this whole thing would be quite so sanguine about the breaking out of chemical, biological, and nuclear warfare in the heart of Europe. Do you know why?
Yeah, I'll give you two reasons. Number one, the United States could care less if every single person in Europe died. I mean, let's be honest, they're kind of moving in that direction when it comes to economic issues anyway. So they are, in the same way that the U.S. empire, that the Biden administration is sacrificing the Ukrainians as cannon fodder, they would be just as comfortable sacrificing the rest of Europe. So they could care less if some kind of a nuclear disaster happens in Europe. That's just something for them to be able to spin. And if a lot of Europeans die, then they'll be able to spin it even more. As far as the European leaders are concerned, it's obvious that there is no independence. One of the things that the Ukrainian military operation has demonstrated to the world is that the European countries have no independence, that their leaders are nothing but puppets for the U.S. And if the U.S. says to them, sacrifice your economies, they're willing to do it. If the U.S. says to them, sacrifice your people through a nuclear, disaster like this, the answer is yes. They are cannon fodder, and the U.S. empire will use them as cannon fodder. And great, we're all the way over here. We don't get into the nuclear fallout. We'll spin it in the newspapers and sacrifice as many Europeans as necessary for this neocon project. It's a cynical way to view the world, but it seems to be pretty appropriate.
Well, I've got a little bit of news for you and a lot of news for those European puppet leaders. I have been in most of Europe over the last 2 to 3 months. In southern Europe, in France actually, and then south, you will not find a single Ukrainian flag or symbol or emblem on any house, any business, any street, carried by any person. In fact, there is bitter anger in Central and Southern Europe at the perception. It's not entirely 100% accurate, because these problems were coming down the pipeline long before the Ukraine happened. But the perception that their economies are being ruined by their government's response at Biden's behest to the events in the Ukraine. In every shop, cafe, restaurant, petrol station queue, every football crowd that I sat amongst in the pre-season friendlies I watched, everywhere people are absolutely furious about this place that the leaders of their countries have put them in. And in Germany, where admittedly there will be more Ukrainian flags, like in the Netherlands, like even still in Britain, though declining fast, 62% of the German people want the resignation of the Chancellor Scholz, little soldier Scholz, has the support of fewer than 25% of his people. 25. Joe Biden, not that much more in the US. We don't even have a prime minister ourselves at this moment. Macron has lost his majority. Draghi is out in Italy. The government of Bulgaria has already fallen. You see my point? That the US maybe should not take for granted the ongoing quiescence of public opinion in Europe. And there may be other political heads to fall.
Yes, and again, I will use those examples, great examples, to go back to the response of Russia and China. It seems to me that out of desperation, the U.S. empire recognizes that this thing's falling apart. This project's falling apart, and in particular, the people of Europe are waking up to the reality that they have no independence and no sovereignty, and that they never did. And they're going to be very, very angry, particularly going into next winter. And I believe that the kinds of provocations we're seeing now are over the top. The Pelosi visit, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, et cetera. And I think the Russian and the Chinese leaders realize that time is on their side, and that all they have to do is sit back, not respond to the provocations, not, attack some NATO or American target that will, that could cause the Europeans or the Americans to get behind their government and say we have to respond, to sit back and allow, as the Iranians say, thank God for making my enemies fools, allow these fools to take this thing in the natural direction that they will take it. They have pretty much wiped out the illusion of democracy, particularly what's going on here with, former President Trump. And that's why I said I think this thing's falling apart, and the Russians are going to sit, and the Chinese are going to allow it to happen. They're going to hold they're going to keep their powder dry, in spite of what I think will be repeated provocations. And of course, I think the European people, there's going to be no way to stop this kind of revolutionary tide that will push back against neoliberalism.
Well, speaking of fools, we have seen the back of the wisest fool in Christendom, Boris Johnson. He'll be replaced with an equally foolish, indeed, I'm sorry to put it this way, as bluntly as this, a stupid woman by the name of Liz Truss. She's Boris Johnson without the laughs, without any class, without the Latin. She is going to be a major step down, intellectually speaking, from Boris Johnson. You've got Joe Biden that you wouldn't send out to buy a loaf, and his only real challenger is Donald Trump. How's that going? They're deliberately trying to criminalize Trump precisely because they know that he would defeat Joe Biden and Kamala Harris even more convincingly. Don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And what's going on here is they are desperate to recognizing that the Democratic Party and that the neoliberal leadership in the United States has so decoupled from the American people that they can't possibly get any support politically, electorally. Instead, they decided to go in the other direction and try to take Trump down. But let's keep in mind something about elections, particularly presidential elections. The Constitution it sets the sole standards for who can run and who can't run. In 1920, I believe it was, Eugene Debs, who was imprisoned for pushing back against World War I. But at any rate, he ran for president from prison. So the idea that they can charge, they're looking for anything that they can charge Trump with. Hopefully they'll get a conviction and then they can stop him from running. Well, history tells us that I would imagine that the precedent of Debs clearly shows that any legal restrictions set up for running for president outside of the constitutional standards would never hold. So I don't think they'll be able to stop Donald Trump. I do think that going into the midterms, when the Democrats get beaten as bad as they will get beaten, and this is important, in the neoliberal wing of the Republican Party, the Lindsey Grahams and the Mitch McConnell neoliberal wing of the Republican Party, I think they're going to take a thumping too. That the attack on Donald Trump will have a significant effect on the Republican Party because a lot of people who may have even sided with that neoliberal wing are going to start circling the wagons around the populist, around the Trump wing. And I think they're actually going to make Donald Trump stronger. And the Trump wing, not just Donald Trump, the Trump wing of the party is going to get a significant tailwinds from this act.
And speaking of those, Liz Cheney, daughter of Dick Cheney, the mass murderer in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the man who made billions for his companies out of those wars. She was comprehensively thrashed in a primary by a Trump-supporting Republican opponent. And she's now decided that, while she couldn't make it in Wyoming, she can run for president, maybe in double harness with Mike Pence. How serious is that as a prospect?
It makes as much sense as Andrew Yang's Forward Party, a party that has brought together the neocons from the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and the pretense that that somehow this is something different. So no, I don't think that various versions of neocon and neoliberal politicians, whether it's Andrew Yang's group or whether it's Mike Pence's group, inside of the Republican Party, they will get thrashed. We saw what happened in 2016 when a bunch of those particular people, the Jeb Bushes, et cetera, when there was 19 of them and Trump stomped every one of them. So Donald Trump, if he is the candidate or a Trump-like figure, a Trump-esque figure, will wipe the floor with those people. It's, again, they're trying to convince themselves, the pundits. If the pundits were all voting, then Pence and Cheney would win in a landslide. But they have no idea what the actual people of America want. They have no clue, and they're trying to tell the American people what they want, and the American people are getting further and further away from them.
Garland Nixon, as always, thanks for joining us.